So, and to kind of clarify the energy point, it's not necessarily that I expect, for example, a huge bullish cycle right ahead. Is that I expect that the overall market is flat to up, and that there's more kind of risk to the upside than the downside. And so, as that plays out, I think inflation is going to be similar in the sense that I'm not expecting necessarily massive inflation by this time next year, but I do think that the average baseline level of inflation is going to remain higher than it was last decade on average, basically higher highs and higher lows, and that overall that the trend is basically at least mild surprises to the upside, and then of course certain geopolitical events or certain disruptions could cause major dislocations to the upside, either in energy prices or overall kind of inflation measures or both.
In a recent analysis, Lynn Alden highlights the evolving dynamics of the US economy. With a nuanced view on inflation, Alden forecasts a sustained uptick in baseline inflation levels compared to the previous decade. While acknowledging the role of technology in certain sectors driving disinflation, such as electronics and manufactured goods, she emphasizes the potential for larger than normal gaps between categories. Energy prices, in particular, could emerge as significant contributors to real-world inflation, given their relative resilience to technological deflation. Moreover, Alden discusses the shift away from a 30-year trend of globalization and its implications for future economic resilience. As geopolitical tensions persist, the once interconnected global system faces challenges, potentially leading to further disruptions.
And I think that there's somewhat of a push and pull there. So when we look at the role of technology deflation, for example, there's certain advancements in technology can make some areas cheaper, right? So TVs get cheaper, computers get cheaper, manufactured goods get cheaper. Now, AI can make certain white collar work cheaper because you're offloading some of that to a processor. Now you're competing with that on price, and so that can be disinflationary in certain categories, whereas other categories remain unaffected. And so I think that the energy side is going to be one of those at least relatively unaffected categories by some of those, rapid tech increases in the next, call it 5+ years. And so I think you could see bigger than normal gaps between different categories. Over the past decade, for example, things like healthcare, education, housing, all of that was inflating at a really rapid pace, where it was being offset in the CPI by electronics, manufactured goods, textiles, things like that. And I think if you could kind of run that over the next decade, I think you could see white collar labor, certain services, certain things like that be a little bit more disinflationary, whereas things like energy could be more significant contributors and kind of real world stuff. That kind of ties in also to reshoring some manufacturing, which is a very long and expensive process, and adds generally to prices. The world that we had over the past 30 years was one of rapid globalization. So, China reconnected with the rest of the world. All that Eastern labor connected to Western capital markets, and kind of that was a very disinflationary force and way more productive. Russia, the Soviet Union fell and opened up and connected to the rest of the world. Their energy and materials connected to Europe. That was all kind of these separate systems coming together, which is disinflationary and generally productive, but it came at the cost of resilience. Everything's kind of all connected together globally, and so it only takes fairly modest geopolitical issues between former enemies, and that gets thrown out the window. And so I think that we don't have that 30-year trend in front of us anymore. I think best case scenario would just kind of stay somewhat isolated. Worst case scenario, there's obviously more disruptions ahead. And so these are all kind of background inflationary forces. And then it just becomes a matter of how large are those relative to certain pockets of disinflation, like AI on white collar wages and things like that.
In this next discussion, Lynn Alden sheds light on the complex interplay between debts, deficits, and inflation in the US economy. Drawing parallels with historical periods like the 1940s, Alden underscores the current scenario where monetized fiscal deficits rather than excessive bank lending are driving money creation. With public debt soaring to 120% of GDP, traditional monetary policy tools like interest rate hikes appear less effective in curbing inflationary pressures. Instead, Alden anticipates continued large deficits, potentially leading to liquidity issues in the Treasury market. Should such problems arise, the Federal Reserve may intervene with liquidity injections, akin to the industrial policies of the 1940s. However, she notes differences in spending patterns, with current deficits often fueling consumption rather than production. Despite these nuances, Alden forecasts a trend towards higher baseline inflation levels.
So overall, the debts and deficits are net inflationary, but again, there's other forces. And so the description I like to use is the 1940s, because when people think of inflation, they often think of the 70s. And there are some parallels to the 70s, including, for example, the risk of energy disruptions. But there's two major sources of money creation in an economy, in a fractional reserve economy. Either it's from bank lending, so fractional reserve bank lending, lending creates more deposits in the system, which then get used for more lending, or you run monetized fiscal deficits, and you have the kind of central bank kind of partially facilitating the spending of the government, and that kind of injects money into the system. And so in the 1970s, the bulk of new money creation was from lending. And it was because the baby boomers were entering their home buying years for like a 10, 15, 20-year stretch there. And that was a period of just more rapid credit growth because of that. And then they ran into, of course, energy constraints. So you had both sides of the coin. In the 1940s, you had a similar level of average inflation for the decade, but banks were barely lending at all. Instead, most of the new money creation was coming from very large fiscal deficits involved in the war, involved in building out manufacturing, involved in, even when the GIs came home, putting them through like college and technical schools and mortgage assistance and all that. That's all basically domestic and foreign kind of fiscal stimulus is getting monetized, increasing the overall money in the system and going around the banking sector. Or in many cases, the banking sector is forced to purchase a lot of those bonds to finance it. And so far in the 2020s, we're closer to the 1940s scenario, which is that our higher than normal period of money supply growth and our higher than normal inflation levels were not because of excessive bank lending. They were because of very large monetized fiscal deficits. The second point there is that when you look at the 70s, how do they slow down inflation? They got much tighter monetary policy. They raised rates, and that's effective because mostly what the Fed does is target the bank lending sector. So by increasing interest rates, they slow down the rate of bank lending, slow down the desire to borrow. And it does have the effect of increasing fiscal deficits because it increases the interest expense that the government pays. But back then, public debt was 30% of GDP, and most of the money supply was growing from the lending sector. So if you jack interest rates up to double digits, it is disinflationary. The problem is when you have a scenario like the 1940s or like a scenario today, where you have 120% debt to GDP, when you raise interest rates, it does mildly slow down the bank lending, but that's not where the most money creation is coming from. Instead, it's coming from the deficit, and higher rates make the deficit even bigger. And so monetary policy tools are generally less effective at dealing with fiscal-driven inflation. And so overall, my base expectation for the next 5, 10, 15 years is continued very large deficits. Should those deficits result in liquidity problems in the treasury market or adjacent markets, the Federal Reserve is practically forced to come in and assist with those with liquidity injections, basically balance sheet expansion. And all of that is a net positive liquidity inflationary force that's more kind of industrial policy, more like the 1940s. And so when I kind of look forward, it's less that I see a depression in kind of the 1930 sense, and it's more like I see industrial policy in a similar way that the 1940s were. But it's a very different environment because you have older demographics. The spending is probably not getting as targeted as things back then. So back then it went to highways, it went to energy production, it went to manufacturing, whereas now a lot of these fiscal deficits are actually fueling consumption, but not really facilitating the production to meet that consumption. And so on average, I would expect, higher baseline inflation minus whatever we get from that AI component.
Thank you for tuning in to today's analysis of the U.S. economy with Lyn Alden. Here's a quick recap of the key takeaways. Alden anticipates a bullish cycle in the overall market with a trend towards higher baseline inflation levels, driven by monetized fiscal deficits rather than excessive bank lending. Drawing parallels with historical periods like the 1940s, she highlights the potential for liquidity issues in the Treasury market and the Federal Reserve's role in providing liquidity injections. As we navigate through these economic dynamics, it's crucial to stay informed. If you found this discussion valuable, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below.